That was such a fabulous first session. I'm so pleased. And really, the idea of having a historian speak at a conference like this, I got from Shelley Carell, who had a wonderful conference a few months ago. And she had Alice Kessler Harris come and speak about the history of women in the labor movement. And I was just, I don't think I ever took a history course in college. There were no distribution requirements where I went to school. And so I just took psychology and sociology. And so I really didn't know about the history, and I think it's just really great as social scientists for us to be able to situate our work and our thinking in what's gone on before. So, as Amy said, these initial talks in the first panel are to set up some of the concepts and ideas that we'll be exploring in more detail and more specifically as we go through the rest of the talks. But I wanted to just start by giving a little bit of a personal background for me and how I came to this topic, because this is the topic of relationships among women is one that's really near and dear to my heart. And I think as I thought about that, the first thing that came to me is, well, I am a feminist, and I've been a feminist for a very, very long time. And I was in one of those consciousness-raising groups that we just heard about in 1972 when I was 16. So that makes me 58. You don't have to do the math. Almost, I'll be 58 this year. But I was 16, and I grew up in a small rural town in Connecticut. And in the next town over, there was a woman who was the mother of, not even a friend of mine. I don't actually know how I got connected to this, but she had decided that young women in our community needed to really understand feminism, and so somehow I got invited, and some of my friends, and we used to go and sit in her living room in the circle, and she would, sort of ask us questions and get us to be thinking critically about our experience as women. And then I went to a women's college, Smith College. I know, as I said, lots of Smithies here and other women's college graduates, and so that was, certainly formative for me. And then I had my first job after college, and my worst experiences were with other professional women. There was, in fact, one other professional woman in my group, and I think that's actually significant, the numbers. And it was really distressing for me, and I went on to graduate school where I found that my women friends, one of whom is from my class, actually in graduate school, is here, Ellen Kosick, really were my saving grace. I don't think I could have made it through graduate school without them. So I had this question really lingering on my mind as I was thinking about, yeah, what gives? Because they were both, as I said, one of the most difficult, I wouldn't say the worst experience, I'm saying worst, but the difficult relationship I had with this other woman in my department where I was working, and yet also have always found my women friends to be such an amazing source of support. I just don't know how I could do what I do without them. And so as I was thinking about what to write my dissertation on, as we all know, research is really me-search, so I thought I want to get to the bottom of this and think hard about what might be going on. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to write my dissertation on relationships among professional women. And in particular, I was interested, again, as me-search, I was interested in relationships among relatively young professional women, and looking at that question in the context of where were other women in the organization. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But that was in the late 80s. And so when I was reading some book reviews, and I saw that there were 2 books that came out in 1987. So this is right as I'm starting my dissertation research. And I got a little worried because they were about relationships among professional women, and I thought, oh my God, my dissertation's already been done, which I think we all have that fear at some point. But then I actually looked at them, so there was this one, Woman to Woman, From Sabotage to Support, which was actually a book entirely filled with sabotage, stories of sabotage. I think the last chapter might have been a little bit about how we really need to be supporting each other. And then this was Women versus Women, the Uncivil Business War. And again, just these very much taking the one side of the experience that I think many women have with other women. And so I was heartened that my dissertation hadn't actually already been done. But I'm not so heartened by the depictions today. So this is just kind of a random draw of some of the books that are out there. Tripping the Prom Queen, The Truth About Women in Rivalry, In the Company of Women, and this is, Indirect Aggression Among Women, Why We Hurt Each Other and How to Stop. I haven't read any of these books. I'm just kind of engaged by the titles. And then this one, Mean Girls Grown Up. And as I was pulling these book covers off of Amazon, I noticed that the caption underneath this last one was, a groundbreaking investigation into the dark secret of female bonds, rivalry. So again, a very negative picture. And that said, I think with all caricatures, there is some truth to it. And I think it's interesting to think about the rivalry and rivalry for what. And I think that when we hear from Aida Hurtado in the next panel, she's going to speak a little bit to that. But I also, before getting into the research, I wanted to just juxtapose some of these titles, these books, with books that are about men's workplace relationships. So here's one, Thinking Strategically, The Competitive Edge in Business, Politics, and Everyday Life. Again, the competitive edge, how to win every time you compete. And then finally, Compete, Play, Win, Finding Your Best Competitive Self. And so I just find it really striking that when we talk about competition in relationships among men, it seems to stem from this kind of very purely rational, legitimate desire for more status and power. And yet, when we talk about conflict or competition among women, we're talking, it's always characterized more negatively. So I have to say also, when I was on the internet, I found a few other interesting things on just kind of traveling not too far from the earlier website. And so here is a cartoon. Right, mean girls grow up to be mean, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's really incredible. And here's another one. This is just, again, maybe you should try eating some makeup so you can be pretty on the inside. So I think these cartoons capture one dimension of that negativity, and I have to say that I think that we're talking about intersectionality, and a lot of times when we talk about intersectionality, we think, oh, we're talking about women of color. Well, we're talking about intersectionality when we talk about white women too, right? Because white women have a race, and we are positioned in our race and class and other kinds of statuses, and I do think there is something about that these characterizations are particularly apt to be used to describe relationships among white women. So I think I'm very interested to have part of the conversation in these 2 days be about, to what extent are these caricatures, do they hold any truth for relationships among women in other locations, racially and class-wise? I think it's an empirical question. I don't know that we have the answer to that. There isn't a whole lot of research out there on relationships among women. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that we want to replace men in those, the characterizations of men on those book covers necessarily, but I do want to suggest that I don't think we can understand relationships among women without looking at the context of inequality in which all of these relationships play out. And so, we are operating in a system of patriarchy, where, I love saying that in Harvard Business School, I get to say, we're operating in a system of patriarchy. And nobody's balking. I think it's terrific. Or maybe you are, but anyway. So white, middle and upper middle class, typically straight men are those who hold positions of power. And I do think that this is a fundamental fact that shapes our relationships with each other. And again, other interlocking systems of oppression. Oh, how did that happen? Is that on? Sorry about that. Just get, okay. So we have all these hierarchies organized around a variety of different social categories, but we also have organizational hierarchies. And I actually personally think organizational hierarchies are a good thing. That's probably debatable in this room. I'm sure not everyone would agree. But what I do think is highly problematic is that these systems of hierarchy are correlated with each other. So some people have talked about this as fault lines. So, or correlated intergroups. Clay Alderfer was actually talking about essentially fault lines where different social categories are falling along the same line. So what we end up seeing in the senior ranks of organizations is a particular, gender, race, class. So and also at the top. So at the top of the organization. Excuse me. So that was the fundamental insight that was the kind of the underpinning of my dissertation research. And I wanted to look at how might we understand relationships among women as a function of how much power women have in the organization. And so, as I said, these things are correlated, and I kind of skimmed off the very top of those stacked up hierarchies and was looking at relationships among white professional women in law firms, and I looked in firms where there were small number of, so these are large law firms, so not very many women partners. This is how I was operationalizing power. So I had 4 firms where there were only a few women in the partnership of these firms, and then I had 4 firms that I had matched them to, where I call them sex integrated in the work that I've written about. They're actually, the cutoff was 15% women in the partnership, and those were my kind of high proportion firms, because in the late 80s, that was as high as you could go and still have something in your sampling domains, some firms to choose from. And I have to say, so I'm a little embarrassed I'm talking about research I did in the late 80s, but on the other hand, it's not changed. If I were to do this study today, my cutoff would probably be 15, maybe 17%, because we are really stalled out at that number. And so my question was, does it matter how much power women have in the senior ranks of an organization? Does that matter for the kinds of relationships that women lower down in the organization are able to develop with each other? And my hypothesis was that it did matter, and that in particular in firms that were male-dominated, women lower down would have a more difficult time developing relationships of support and would be more competitive with each other. I was also interested in relationships, sort of hierarchical relationships. So I did ask, even though I was really focused on junior women, I didn't talk to any senior women. I wanted to know, what is your perception of senior women? I had a sense also in these male-dominated firms that those perceptions might be more negative. And in the what I called sex-integrated firms, my hypothesis was that there would be more relationships of support and less competition in relationships among women peers, that is, women in the associate ranks of these firms, and that the hierarchical relationships would be more positive. And I should say that even, by the way, in the late 80s, these associateships were about 50% women. The entering classes into law firms for that long, and longer, because it had been that way for a while, had been about 50% women. And then, the fall off comes over the course of women's time in the associate ranks, and then at the level of partner, that's where we really see the fall off. We saw it then, and we see it now. So let me just, my hypothesis was that the quality of group relations depends on where, within group relations, so relationships among members of a group depends on where that group is positioned in the status hierarchy. That's the kind of general hypothesis. And again, I think it would be interesting to think about other groups and to what extent does this hypothesis hold if we were to look at other underrepresented groups in positions of organizational authority, and to look at the dynamics of relationships among them. So here are my findings. So I had proportional representation of senior women as the kind of primary independent variable. And again, this is operationalizing the degree to which women have power in the organization. And so under the conditions of low proportions, I also looked at what is it like to be a woman in this kind of, in this environment. And I was really looking at questions, you know, do you see differences between men and women? Is it a positive, you know, how do you, you know, what's the valence of those differences? And what I found was that there was this really interesting mediator, because I'm going to tell you about the relationships in a moment, but the mediator of those, of the impact of women's power on their relationships was how women constructed themselves as women. So how did they think of themselves as women? Was it a positive thing or a negative thing? And in these firms, I found that it was pretty universally a negative thing. Now, women dealt with that in a variety of different ways. Some of them distanced themselves from women, and so you get to see, like, when you're, if it's not good to be female in your organization, and then you have the prospect of interacting with other women, what does that kind of notion of what it means to be a woman do to your relationships with other women? And my thought was that it might interfere. And that's also where I saw these so-called double binds, the damned if you do, doomed if you don't, competence, likability, trade-off kind of stories from these women. And then I looked at their relationships with women partners, and this was, I think, the most striking finding in the research. It was just universally negative. Now, a lot of the women had not had actual interactions with the women partners in their firms. A lot of this is by reputation, so it makes sense that it would be a bit more caricatured anyway. But it was like really negative, really negative. They're bad role models, they act too much like men, they're too sexual, they slept their way to the top, and gender was just not a basis of identification whatsoever. In a minute, I'll just read you a couple of quotes. I'll close with a few quotes to give you kind of a flavor of what these women were talking about. And then in terms of their relationships with their women peers, they were, as I anticipated, they tended not to be supportive, and they were competitive. Now, I have I'm calling these dysfunctionally competitive because actually what I learned when I was talking to these women across the board, so no matter what firm they were in, I would say, I had them draw a relational map. I actually got this idea from Ella, who had done something like this in her dissertation. By the way, Ella was on my committee. She was just a few months older than I. And you know, Ella, you're the only one who liked my dissertation, I have to say, too. Other than me, I liked my dissertation, too. The other two guys on my committee, they weren't so into it. But anyway, so I had them draw these relational maps, and, you know, who do you interact with? And then they kind of, you know, drew all these different people and kind of positioned themselves in relation to them. And I asked them to then describe each relationship. And what I learned right off the bat was, like, everybody was competitive with everybody. So that was not going to be a distinguishing feature of these relationships. But when I actually heard the stories of competition, I heard in these firms, the male-dominated firms, that the competition was impossible to get through and actually damaged the relationship. So that's why I described them as dysfunctionally competitive. In the high proportional representation, so these are firms where women had more power. What I found was that women said being a female, being a woman in this firm is either it doesn't matter, they didn't really notice it, or it was a good thing. So they would describe these sex differences that they had observed, and they would say, but actually it's an advantage to me in a variety of ways to be female here. Relationships with women partners, just, again, across the board, completely the opposite. So they're great role models, they're supportive, and there was this way in which these younger women felt they could identify with these senior women, again, not necessarily having ever worked with them, but they had gender as a basis for identification. And then their women peers were supportive, those relationships were more supportive, And as I said, they were competitive, but they were able to stay in relationship. They were able to work through the competition by talking to each other and come out the other side with a relationship that was sustained. So I think I'm at my time. Yeah, so I got to stop. I won't read those quotes, but I'm happy to share them with you. They're also published. Thank you very much, and we'll turn to the next